Okay, this screencast is going to pick up with several different civil rights organizations, modern civil rights organizations that are kind of popping up during this movement. The NAACP kind of has that historical long-term significance. These will be newer organizations formed in these decades, like following World War II. The first one we're going to talk about is SNCC. That stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Obviously including mostly students from college campuses around the country. A lot of times SNCC organizations would pop up in universities, especially in the North, just because that was obviously where most people who were more concerned about civil rights were located, not as common of organizations in the South, but they would do work in the southern states. So you would have students kind of coming together, volunteering in this committee, trying to draw attention to civil rights and the need for federal intervention in states in the South addressing issues such as segregation. They definitely engaged in nonviolent protest measures, non-confrontational, or even if they found themselves in confrontation, they themselves were not doing the confronting. So their protest methods were very peaceful. For example, one of their most common forms of protests were known as sit-ins, where essentially interracial members would go into a location, usually like a restaurant or a lunch counter, or any place where segregation was practiced and implied, meaning they should not be there, that blacks were not legally welcome to, go to these places, and they would go and sit in and just refuse to leave. They, in theory, are breaking the law, as their presence there is unwanted, but they are not acting violently or radically, but they do very much generate a kind of violent, radical response from the segregationists who would not want them there. So just look at what you see in the screen. If you actually look at the picture for a little bit longer, I know my bar is kind of hiding some of it, but these, members of SNCC, both black and white members, you'll note, are simply sitting in a lunch counter, being basically attacked by this mob who are dumping drinks on them, throwing food on them. They would often be arrested, the students sitting in, even though the media is obviously capturing the mob as being the kind of aggressive group here. These are some other pictures. The most famous sit-in, the first big one, happened in North Carolina in Greensboro at a lunch counter at a Woolworths, which Woolworth is like a department store. They had a lunch deli, and SNCC members went and sat in and kind of called the nation to respond as well, and those members were arrested. That counter actually sits at the National U.S. History Museum at the Smithsonian. You may have seen it. Also, there's Woolworths and a couple of other locations where famous sit-ins occurred in New Orleans. I believe one on Canal Street, one on Magazine. There's a plaque somewhere on Magazine Street honoring that sit-in there in New Orleans, just to kind of show you at the local level. Another example of non-violent protest that was practiced by SNCC members were something called the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were they were organized in an effort to challenge this new law, this new federal ruling that came out saying that interstate buses needed to be integrated. We've seen this happen with schools, with Brown v. Board. We saw the response in Alabama to the Montgomery bus boycott with city buses being integrated. But interstate buses are the buses that travel from state to state, long distances. You see in this picture there's the Greyhound symbol. And so what happens with interstate buses is if one state had segregated buses and one state did not, then in theory people could board a bus together, in the north, head down south, and before the bus was allowed to enter into that southern state, they would have to get off and separate into different buses because that practice was illegal there. So what this law is saying, what the Supreme Court basically made a ruling saying all interstate buses had to integrate, that segregating interstate buses was no longer allowed. SNCC wants to challenge to see if the southern states are going to abide by this law. So they basically organized these series of freedom rides in the, I think, early 1960s, maybe late, I think early 1960s. And they are attempting to basically get on integrated buses and head into the southern states. They wanted to hit all the major stops along the route of the southern states, drawing national attention. And as you can see, somewhere in, I think, Alabama or Mississippi, I think this picture is from Alabama, actually. The angry mob is waiting at one of the terminals, and they slash the bus's tires, and the bus then has like a blowout, and they throw a firebomb on the bus, and then begin beating the riders, the SNCC members, as they're exiting. So it was met with violence, which draws a lot of national attention. You have to understand, pictures like this, even the Woolworth counter picture from the last slide, this draws national attention to the behavior and the types of circumstances that blacks are being met with in the South, and that causes people to want to instigate change. And just kind of keep that in mind for a minute here. The next organization we're going to talk about is Dr. King's organization. That's the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Very similar to SNCC in its design to, protest very peacefully and non-violently. In fact, Martin Luther King prided himself on a policy known as civil disobedience, where one would break a law that they deemed immoral, but they would break the law peacefully and non-violently, specifically. And then usually that action would be met with violence, which makes the person breaking the law actually look like the victim, which was kind of the goal, is to kind of gain sympathy for the victims, of this era and why civil rights is even necessary. So you can definitely kind of assume the Christian undertone in this group, since we're Christians in the title, but it was formed by a bunch of ministers, including Dr. King. Dr. King wants to draw attention to cities in the South that have extreme segregation and danger for minorities and danger for African Americans, and no city was as dangerous as Birmingham, Alabama. Now, I want to be clear, I've heard Birmingham's a lovely city today. I've never been myself. So no insult to Birmingham now, but back in the day, it was a very, very rough place to be, especially if you were black. I believe it actually had the nickname Bombingham because of all of the different bombs that occurred, especially at black churches, killing many people, men, women, children alike, without often any sort of like repercussion or consequence, which is pretty shameful. But you had a very violent police chief, you had a very racist governor. These two men are pictured on the screen. The police chief's on the left, Bull Connor, and George Wallace is the famous segregationist Alabama governor, but you don't need to memorize their names necessarily. But these, two people in power will cultivate this kind of environment where the KKK can do whatever they want without repercussion, because many of the higher-ups in the city and region are in the KKK, and that's the people who should be persecuting and not allowing the KKK to do what they're doing in the South with their scare tactics and bombs and lynchings. There are several cases of murders that go unpunished, lynchings that go unpunished, bombs even at churches that go unpunished. But one event that did stir the nation was something called the Children's March. Dr. King, came into Birmingham from, I think he spent some time in Montgomery, came into Birmingham wanting to draw attention to what was happening, and, is calling for people to organize this march to protest, and it was the kids who wanted to march in protest of segregation and in protest of the police brutality that was experienced in Birmingham. Unfortunately, we can predict that the police and the white kind of police force and the police commissioner will respond violently to any sort of protest that happens, even if it is kids. So I think people, even like MLK, wanted to protect the kids and not allow them to march, but the kids say, well, segregation affects us as much as anyone else, why shouldn't we have the chance? So children organize on a mass scale. There are, hundreds of people show up to participate, not just children, but, adults alike, teachers alike. And on the first day, many are arrested. And then on the second day of the march, more people show up and even more are arrested, to the point where you had hundreds of people in jail. Later on in the week of this demonstration, Bull Connor's going to give permission to the police and the fire department to release the police dogs to attack the kids who are participating in the march, as well as you see in the bottom right picture, they had the fire department release fire hoses on the demonstrators. And a fire hose can pull bark off a tree, so you can imagine that this led to people being slid across asphalt, which is very violent. Of course, all of this is captured on camera, which once again stirs the nation, arouses the nation for a response. So with all of the nation now kind of turning its attention, these are just some examples. Like, we talked about the bus boycott, the march on, the Children's March, stuff happening with the freedom rides, the sit-ins. With the nation kind of learning more about what's happening, they are starting to demand a political response. President Kennedy is the first president to really propose a specific, anti-segregation bill, and he did so towards the end of his first term in office, and it was just called the Civil Rights Bill. Okay, it would have banned segregation in all public accommodations, but the South the South is in Congress as well. Congress will vote it down because of the segregationists in the Congress from the southern states. So this is the setting for the March on Washington, in which civil rights leaders of these various groups, like SNCC, like the SCLC, they will come together and they will organize this mass demonstration in Washington, D.C., where they are trying to call attention to Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. And this is the setting for Martin Luther King giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Many speeches like that were held, many songs were sung, nothing violently, all peaceful forms of protest, but that's the setting for those famous images and songs. And here's some other pictures for you here. And if you ever heard this from Sister Chris freshman year, I did confirm with her, yes, she as a young girl, a young elementary school girl, was actually in attendance of this march in DC, which is pretty impressive and pretty cool. All right, if y'all have any questions, please write them down. I hope you all have a good day.